Chapter 14. Crinan, the Pet Kicker. The Third Hell. Sincroft. The group walked through a dank and moldy alley and approached a building made of black, charred-looking wood. Rats scurried out of their path, and Karsten was forced to punch an aggressive beggar in the jaw, knocking him out. As one of his touched dragged the body into the shadows to feast on it, Karsten led Crinan, Ander, and Malinka inside. The creaky door swung shut behind them, and Karsten removed his hat. He placed it on a peg on the wall and shrugged out of his duster jacket, revealing his denim pants and flannel shirt beneath. He hung his jacket next to his hat and motioned for everyone to sit.
"You're a strange group of people,"
Karsten commented as he leaned against a wall and crossed his arms.
"To be honest, too strange for my liking, but I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to talk business, so let's get straight to it. I have the solution to your little problem. I can get y'all out of here. Sincroft is a special place in the hells, you see. It's a place where we prisoners can make a life for ourselves if we can accept a little give and take. You see, some of the demons want a little extra bang for their buck. They want their opponents to give them a little fight. Here in this place, we have the ability to fight back. Here, we get creative and make challenges for the demons to come after us. We can kill them and send them back to the first level, where they have to start over. There's some folks there who've been doing that for years, decades maybe. Demons come after them to score the big kills, to have a real fighting experience. But the prisoners here, we don't all get along."
Karsten pushed himself off the wall and walked to a small kitchen-looking area. He knelt down in front of a wood stove and peeked inside. Satisfied with the flames burning, he reached out and grabbed the handle of a kettle, lifting it.
"Anybody want some coffee?"
he asked, turning his head to look at his guests. Ander raised his hand, and Karsten grabbed 2 cups and poured the steaming black liquid. With a snort, he turned back around and walked to the others.
"So, there's this fella,"
Karsten said, placing a cup in front of Ander.
"A Lycanny. Goes by the name of Darien. Don't know if that's his real name or not, but I reckon that don't matter. Point is, he's bad news. Done me wrong a time too many, and I'm more than half sick of his shit. My problem is that me and my herd can't get close to him. His herd's bigger, you see."
Karsten took a sip of his coffee and placed the mug down on the table. He took a seat across from Crinan and looked him in the eye.
"Darien runs this part of town like he owns it."
Karsten sighed.
"Little shit comes knocking every once in a while, thinks I need to pay him for protection. I never asked a fucker for shit, but first time I refused was the last time. They done killed half my herd and told me he'd be back in 3 days to collect half my shit. Said that was the introductory fee, the next time it'd be less. Well, next time it wasn't less. Neither was the time after. This has been going on for years, I reckon. I'm barely getting by, starting to question whether the few luxuries I find here are worth my time. Been thinking of running off to Ashland, though the trip will end up with me dying, only fucking brothers know how many times. I don't like dying. I don't like pain. I can take it, but I'd rather not."
"So what?" Crinan asked. "Let's get to it. You want us to kill this Darien guy for you? What do we have to gain out of it?"
"You know, kid, I'm not surprised you're an impatient little bastard," Karsten replied, taking another sip of his drink. "Matches the rest of your personality good. If you'd shut your mouth and listen, I bet you I'll get to it."
Crinan snorted and looked away. Karsten put his mug back on the table and clicked his tongue.
"Yes, I want you to kill Darien," he said contemptuously. "You do that for me, I won't have any problem showing you the way out of Sincroft."
"How do we know there is a way?"
Malinka asked. Everyone looked over at her, but she did not remove her gaze from Karsten.
"We were told that the way is always changing and heavily guarded. How do we know we can trust you?"
"This is a hells, darling,"
Karsten replied, leaning forward.
You can't trust me. You can't trust anyone here. I can't make you, and I'd think you a fool if you did. I can tell you I'm not lying, and I'm good for my word. Also, and don't take this the wrong kind of way, but what on the run do you have to lose?
A fair point our new friend makes, Anders said. And the worst of situations, we would simply be killed and start over in the fields of misery. I say, why not? It's all we have for now.
Can't we just go find the way ourselves? Krynen asked. If he did, we can.
Sure, Karsten replied with a shrug. I ain't stopping you. If that's what you want to do, then I look forward to having the new neighbors for years to come.
Malinka stared at Karsten deeply for a moment before she nodded her head. She reached her hand out towards Karsten, and he raised an eyebrow.
We're in,
she said. Karsten grabbed her hand tightly, and they both stood.
You can learn something from this one, kid,
Karsten said to Krynen as he released her hand.
She's a smart one.
Krynen snickered at that remark and shook his head as he stood with the others.
Whatever, he said. Where do we go? What does he look like?
You'll find Darien 5 blocks north of my home, Karsten said. Hard to miss. Big warehouse and lots of touched inside. Usually lots of blood and pieces of people, too. He's a thin fella, hairy, tall, sharp teeth. You know, I like candy.
Great, Krynen said sarcastically. He turned toward the door, and the others followed.
Gonna need his head for proof,
Karsten called out as Krynen opened the door.
Anybody can say anything, you know.
Oh, I know,
Krynen said as they stepped outside. The door closed behind them, and Krynen rubbed his face with frustration.
Are we really doing this?
He asked as Malinka walked past him.
Do you seriously think he knows anything?
I don't care if he does or not,
Malinka snapped back. Krynen could feel the weight of her coldness toward him in her words.
Like he said, we don't have anything better to do.
We simply hope for the best, my friend. Ander patted Krynen's back as he walked by. Krynen cringed at the touch, but followed. The trio made their way out of the alley and back into the bleeding black stone streets. Prisoners shambled by lethargically, barely sparing the group a contemptuous glare, if any at all. Their tattered cloaks and rat-shoed top hats reminded Krynen of Canrom City, where his parents and brother lived. Krynen glanced at them only briefly as he walked with the others. Apathy is a natural response to this world we live in, Ander commented as he noticed Krynen's attention on the others. The mind teaches us not to care, not to feel. It helps with the pain of our eternal torment and our thoughts of loss. Many of us have shoved the memories of our lives so far deep within the recesses of our psyche that we lose what it is to be an individual. We forget so much. We abandon the rest. We live as drones, walking nowhere and seeking nothing. Krynen reflected on Anders' words. He didn't want to end up like that, to lose himself like all the sad husks of people that walked past him had. Krynen thought about his life as he walked, of his few friends, of his experiences and dreams. He thought of his favorite food, steamed cabbage, and how nobody else liked it, so he always got everyone else's portion. While he was still young and rough around the edges, Krynen liked being himself. He liked very few other people, but he was content with who he was. He was comfortable with the world his mind existed in, with the solitude he lived in. He intentionally pushed others away because very few people had anything to offer him. In his eyes, the mindlessness of their social interactions, the expectations that friends put on one another, and the drama of being a part of other people's lives was too much for him. He didn't want any of that to spoil what he found most dear, himself. At the same time, he couldn't help but glance at Malinka. He watched her walk, her head lowered, her shoulder-length filthy blonde hair clumping together in sections at her neck. He saw the cuts and scratches on the backs of her arms, the scabs on her elbows. The sight of it all made his heart hurt. not simply because she had gone through horrors that Krynen was resolute on never experiencing, but also because out of everyone on Duran, she had been the only person he had ever loved. Krynen thought back to Camelot when he was only 16 years old. He recalled it all, having been kicked out of the Future Centurions program by Captain Bran after beating the shit out of his friend Alec in training, of being sent to the front lines of the Camlosian Civil War as a squire. He remembered the first time he spoke to Malinka, and the looks of contempt her boyfriend gave him as he hovered behind her. Malinka was a snotty little lord's daughter when they first met. He initially didn't like her one bit. When Krynen's knight, Sir Edmund, and Malinka's knight and brother, Sir Dimian, were ambushed, Krynen and Malinka ran. When he closed his eyes, he could see the woods of the Wolshire Highlands of Camelot. He could hear the birds singing and the rabbits rustling in the brush around him. As Krynen and Malinka ventured deeper into the forest and got more and more lost, Krynen remembered how his contempt for her eventually shattered. He didn't want it to, but one night as they sat in front of their small, pitiful fire, their bare arms brushed against each other. Krynen remembered the conversation that followed. He remembered Malinka telling him she was scared and of how he promised her that she didn't have to be with him around. Krynen briefly smiled as he walked. He remembered the feelings of her fingers weaving with his as they ran from enemy fire, of how despite the fact that they were being hunted, he couldn't help but focus on the feelings he was quickly developing for her. It was so easy for him to replay the 5 days they were lost in his mind, every moment, every touch and word. And their single kiss ran through his mind in an instant.
This love is good,
he could hear her saying. For years he heard that voice whispering to him as he fell asleep alone at night. But of course he also remembered his own words. I will find you. The words echoed in his mind when he thought of her. He remembered screaming the words to her when he was being flown away from her by Captain Bran and his father. And, paired with Malinka's own words, Krynen also thought of his broken promise every night. As time passed, he grew afraid. He wanted so badly to reach out to her, to go and find her like he had said, but he never did. When it came to war, Krynen was a centurion. He was strong, skilled, and brave. He could rush into a group of enemies and come out alive and with a bloody sword every time. But when it came to love, Krynen was the lowest of cowards.
Krynen!
Malinka shouted as Krynen slammed into one of the prisoners. The being's hat flew off his head and he fell to the ground, grunting audibly. Krynen quickly pushed himself back up and Malinka knelt to help the dusty prisoner, but the person barely registered her presence. He silently grabbed his torn top hat, placed it on his head, and continued on his way.
Fucking pay attention,
Malinka snapped. She shoved Krynen in his shoulder and scoffed.
What is wrong with you?
Sorry, Krynen said. He dusted his pants off and looked away from her. I was thinking about something.
Well, stop it.
She smacked his shoulder and shook her head with a look of frustration on her face.
Don't think. Don't do anything except get us out of here, if you can even do that.
Fine, Krynen said. He moved to walk around her, but Malinka sidestepped so that she was still in front of him.
Fine?
She repeated, her eyes growing wider.
What is wrong with you?
Nothing, Krynen replied. What's wrong with you?
You are.
Malinka hissed. Well, get the fuck over it, Krynen said. For hating me as much as you do, you sure seem to worry about me a lot. Malinka squinted her eyes fiercely at Krynen and turned around, running to catch up with Ander. Krynen angrily jogged up to follow, and Ander slowed his pace so that the two were walking side by side. I know we only recently became acquainted, Ander said softly, but if I may. Do what you want, Krynen replied. Well, when it seems like a girl is pushing you, she is, Ander replied. Malinka seems to want something out of you. Based on the screaming matches you two have held, I have gathered there is a history between you two. Young love and
Broken promises, I believe.
Crinan remained silent, but gently nodded his head.
Yes, well, Ander continued, ladies are generally smarter than us, more intuitive, able to see the bigger picture. Crinan, I'll be bold. Malinka wants you to step up in some way, whatever that may mean. She has expectations of you, an image of you in her head, and you are failing to meet that image.
Well, that's not my problem, Crinan replied. She knew me when I was 16. That was a long time ago.
Though I would beg to differ, young elf,
Ander said. I'm half-blood, Crinan replied. My father is human.
Indeed.
Ander raised an eyebrow.
Well, if I may offer a word of advice, if that girl sees something in you, then she knows you can be better. For your own sake, deliver on her expectations. You'll thank yourself later in life.
Ander patted Crinan's back and sped back up.
What does he know?
Crinan mumbled as he kicked a stone in his path. The stone didn't budge and instead cracked open a mouth of sharp teeth and bit into Crinan's foot.
By the brothers!
Crinan shouted in surprise and pain. The stone clamped onto him and growled as it shook itself back and forth, apparently trying to rip Crinan's foot loose.
Hey!
One of the prisoners shouted angrily. He stopped his walk and pointed a finger at Crinan.
That lad's kicking the Gravlins!
The Gravlins! Crinan shouted back.
It bit me first!
Crinan pulled his sword free and prepared to stab the creature that had attached itself to him. The prisoners gasped, and many of them produced knives and sticks. Crinan saw this and wondered what the fuck was going on. The Gravlin bit down harder, and Crinan kicked his foot. The creature wouldn't budge.
Stay yourselves, my friends!
Ander shouted as he ran back up to Crinan.
The lad doesn't know what he does.
Ander quickly knelt down and started tenderly scratching the surface of the Gravlin.
There we are. All is well, little creature. He means you no harm.
Two beady black eyes suddenly opened, and the Gravlin loosened its hold on Crinan's foot. It started making a strange purring noise like a cat, and it fell to the ground, its vicious-looking mouth forming into a smile. Crinan had half a mind to punt the shitty little thing, but ultimately decided against it.
Mind what you do here, young one, Ander whispered as he stood. Many things are not as they seem. The locals treat the Gravlins as pets. They find them cute.
It's a fucking rock, Crinan retorted, looking down at his bleeding foot.
Well, it is not, but I understand, Ander replied. Come, we are nearing the compound. Let us complete this task that we may get out of this city before you start squashing Cthulhutos and really making the Syncroftians mad.
What the fuck is a Cthulhuto?
An adorable little tentacly ball of snuggly comfort, Ander replied. But don't fall asleep around one, lest you want it to crawl into your mouth and slowly eat you from the inside out.
The hell's is stupid, Crinan sighed. The monsters back home are much better than they are here. Ander smiled and ushered Crinan forward. They finally caught up with Malinka and stopped on either side of her. Malinka looked over at Crinan and crossed her arms.
You kicked someone's pet?
She asked with a tone of disbelief. I didn't know, Crinan replied.
Of course you didn't,
Malinka sighed. Before them was a large stone wall with multiple heads on spikes atop it. The blood from the heads dripped down the stone, and the walls were stained red from apparent years of gore. Behind the wall was a wide gray 4-story building with boarded-up windows. Crinan approached a tall, rusted gate and peered into the courtyard ahead of them.
Oh shit, he wasn't lying, Crinan said as he stared at what had to have been dozens of touched.
They shambled around the courtyard, maniacally laughing or bitterly crying to themselves. Some picked at their skin or pulled on their hair, while others simply lay in a fetal position on the ground.
Well, Crinan said as Ander approached, I guess we just kill them?